Further, would remind folks that in Jefferson's Manual of Parliamentary Practice and Procedure, while we have gone away from that, we weren't supposed to talk about what the Senate might or might not do because we're two independent bodies. With that, I recognize Mr. Roy for his questions.
Thank the chairman. Thank both the chairman and the ranking member for appearing before the committee. We spent a lot of time together last week, or the week before, I guess. Mr. Chairman, we have before us a budget. Is that correct?
That's correct.
It's a budget resolution. We have no specific policies or programs that are directly laid out in said budget as it relates to where any spending or tax policy or anything else should be directed, right?
That's accurate.
There are instructions to committees. Is that right?
That's right.
There are instructions committees to meet the goals of the budget. Is that right?
Correct.
I'll ask the chairman a question carefully and state it in the form of what I believe. He can agree or disagree with it. That it would be ideal if we were balancing our budget. We are not. That we currently are spending roughly $7 trillion a year in our total spend.
That's correct.
That is up from $4.5 trillion a year in 2019 pre-COVID. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So we are up $2.5 trillion in just over 5 years. Is that correct?
52% since COVID.
That is driven in significant part by inflation, by policies that have been adopted and that have driven inflation over that time. True?
That's true.
Also driven in significant part by policies pursued by the previous administration and to some degree Congress. True?
Including $2 trillion in executive orders by President Biden.
Which have both an inflationary impact as well as a budgetary impact, correct?
That's correct.
In addition, the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called subsidies, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, 90% of said subsidies go to billion-dollar corporations.
That's correct.
That those subsidies have both an inflationary impact and a budgetary impact, correct?
That's correct.
And we are dealing with the impact of both the budgetary impact and inflationary impact, correct?
That's correct.
So what the American people want us to do and what we're trying to do with the budget is try to close that gap and figure out how we can get that back down in terms of constraining the size, scope, and government programs, which is both causing the inflation that is then causing the spending, and the spending is causing the inflation, and it's a vicious circle. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. Well put.
And that I assume the chairman would agree with me that we could reduce spending and that we should seek as a goal to try to get back to the pre-COVID trajectory of spending. Is that correct?
That would be a reasonable goal.
Yeah, we could do better, but that would be at least a modest goal to try to get back to that. And I used the word trajectory. I didn't say we'd go back to exactly that specific level. So for example, our friend from Wisconsin, Senator Johnson, has said, and I'm not going to comment on what the Senate will do or not do, but just on what the senator has spoken about, that the senator has pointed out that if you adjusted that 2019 level of spending for Medicare, Social Security, interest payments with increase of interest, and adjusted it for inflation along those lines, that we should be at $6 trillion. Is that roughly correct to your understanding?
That's my understanding.
Which would be $1 trillion less than the $7 trillion we're currently spending.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm going to say this sheepishly. Does the budget that we adopted last week come close to addressing even that $1 trillion shortfall in the single year?
In the grand scheme of things, it's a meaningful step in the direction we must go and the continuous effort to rein in unnecessary and wasteful spending. But relative to the $7 trillion budget and the $1 trillion in additional spend post-COVID, we're talking about 150 to 200 billion a year.
And does the budget that was adopted make certain assumptions? It does, correct?
That's correct.
Are the assumptions that the budget makes, we build into it spending reductions and instructions to reduce spending of what you just described of 150 to 200 billion dollars a year annually to total $1.5 to $2 trillion over 10 years? Is that one of our assumptions?
That's correct.
That's an instruction.
That's an instruction.
And then an assumption is that we are assuming 2.5%, roughly 2.55% economic growth.
That's correct. Which
Now-
was the growth rate the last year of President Trump with unilateral Republican leadership, Republican policies in place, and it's well below the average of the recent and long-term history of our country and our economy.
And correct me if I'm right. Now, look, full disclosure, right? Our recent trends have been closer to 2% growth. Is that correct over the last couple of decades?
That's correct.
Fair characterization. CBO currently has baked into the baseline an estimate of 1.8% growth.
That's
correct. We have had history in the United States over the last, I think, roughly century, give or take, historic growth, and CBO would confirm this, of 3.2% growth. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Over the history of what we've been
Some
cataloging.
decades we had 4%.
Correct. Some have been higher. We had the U.S. economy grew, to the best of my knowledge, 3.6% in 21 to 24, 2.7%, 22 to 24, 2.8% in 24, 3.1% since World War II. We grew by more than 3% in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, by more than 4% in the 60s and 50s. And so our budget assumes 2.55% economic growth. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Does the chairman agree that that is well within historical norms and averages?
I think it's conservative.
And so I would ask, in fairness to
With
the ranking,
respect to historical average, I think
Sure.
it's conservative.
I'd like to ask on this point, in fairness to the ranking member with whom we've got a great relationship on the committee,
Yes.
would the ranking member agree that while it is admittedly higher than what CBO is projecting in its budget, right, that it is well within historic norms if you look at the broad base of American history and a number of the times in which we've achieved economic growth over the last decade even, that we've surpassed 2.5% growth?
Well, first, Mr. Roy, thank you very much for pointing out just how much this economy grew under President Biden. I appreciate you pointing that out. Second, you stated you went through the last 3 years, starting with 2021. Part of what enabled tremendous growth initially, especially in the employment sector, was the fact we declined dramatically in 2020. So I think we have to actually take the full 4 years into account going back to 2020. I do believe the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, as well as others, have said a projected growth rate each and every year for the next 10 years of 2.8% is unrealistic. Finally, we did achieve tremendous growth year over year in the 1950s and the post-World War II years. Assuming that we can do that again, and I hope we can, but I'm not sure where the justification lies for that.
Well, would the gentleman agree, though, it wasn't just and I'm trying to level set the history of it, not get into like a sparring debate over it, but that it wasn't just the post-World War II timeframe, right? I mean, we had 4%.
1950s, 1960s,
4%
part of
in
a
the
growing
60s and 50s, 3% in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We've had significant times over 2.5%, even in the last 2 decades when it's been lower. Chairman, you have something you want to add to that?
Well, I just for perspective, first of all, you had a 2.7 if you control for the year of COVID growth rate for President Biden. You had a 2.8 average for pre-COVID for President Trump. But let's be clear, the CBO's projections are based on current law.
Right.
That is, the current laws as advanced primarily over the last 4 years by Democrats. Current laws and policies that pay people not to work, current laws and policies that have increased our tax liability, current laws and policies that have heaped $2 trillion, and that's conservative, of cost in regulations in all 4 corners of this economy, and the current law that portends this 1.8% growth rate, annual average, also does so with the expectation that the TCJA, or Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, would expire. So I don't doubt that we would have, I think it would be a stretch to get to 1.8% annual average. If you allow these tax cuts to expire, if you continue with this massive regulatory administrative state that has been created. So I think that's a conservative number. I think it would be much lower, but with the pro-growth policies, there is no doubt in my mind, recent history or recent past history or in the long run, We are extremely conservative.
And stated differently, should we seek as our objective to have 1.8% economic growth?
Absolutely not.
Right. And so recognizing that reality and recognizing a century of 3.2% growth, certainly 3.1% growth since World War II, we're not assuming 3% growth. We're not even assuming the historic average, right? I mean, that one might argue, well, okay, well, that's pretty robust in your assumption. Like, we're assuming the sweet spot between where we've been in the doldrums of a highly regulated economy.
That's right.
And trying to free that economy up through deregulation, RAINS Act, energy freedom, policies the president's trying to embark upon, as well as tax policy we're trying to make more permanent or certainly extended to try to create economic growth and to get us out of the doldrums of 1.8 to 2% growth. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
And so so for the world to understand, I say this as a fiscal conservative, you have to make some assumptions. And so if you make an assumption of 2.5% growth, when your goal is 3 to 3.2 or 3.5 or more growth,
That's right.
but you know that there's a reality it could be 2, you're trying to make an assumption based on where you hope it will be at least and higher. I am of the belief that we can get to 2.5% and higher if we just do our basic job of getting the hell out of the way. Does the chairman agree?
I couldn't agree more.
Okay.
And
then
fully expect us to exceed the 2.5% growth.
on the issue overall on what we're talking about, because some people have raised concerns about draconian cuts. My understanding of the CBO baseline outlays over 25 to 2034, from 2025 to 2034, is that would total $85.7 trillion over 10 years. And that what the House instructions would produce is $84.071 trillion. So I just want to put in perspective for the world what we're talking about. We're talking about over 10 years, that level of shift. What we're talking about on an annual basis in a $7 trillion spend versus $4.5 trillion a mere 5 years ago, we're talking about trying to save a floor of $150 to $200 billion. That is 2 to 3% of the total spend. And I think the question here we have to ask ourselves is, are we incapable as Congress of coming up with 2 to 3% savings in the bloat of $7 trillion? Are we that incapable? Are we that incompetent as the 435 leaders in the House and the 100 senators of finding 2 to 3% of savings for a mere down payment of $150 to $200 billion on what we're dealing with a $7 trillion spend? Does the chairman think that is a reasonable step for us to try to take?
I think some would consider it underwhelming to merely reduce spending by $200 billion a year with the context of all that we're spending now, all the more we're spending post-COVID, and with an additional $21 trillion in CBO's current projections to be added to the debt, doubling the deficits, almost tripling interest expenses. This thing is coming off the rails, and we're talking about $1.5 to $2 trillion over the 10 years in reduced, wasteful, fraudulent, and unnecessary spending.
And last question. This is a budget we're talking about, and so we're really not talking about programs. Okay, that's something you talk about when we get to a reconciliation package. You figure out what you're doing on tax policy, you figure out what you're doing on spending. But a number of issues have been raised here in this committee, here before this for the record. And I think the chairman was making the point that our goal should be to reduce the number of people who require SNAP programs or assistance through other government programs. And I think I share the gentleman's sentiments on that. But would the gentleman also agree that the unilateral revaluation of the TFP, absent any cost constraints, and the unilateral action through thrifty SNAP was a significant effort by the Biden administration to transform policy in a way that is massively expensive relative to its benefit provided, and with respect to the SNAP programs? Does the gentleman agree?
It was almost $300 billion increase with the stroke of a pen.
I have data that the unilateral expansion of the SNAP program lowered labor force participation among working age SNAP recipients. Is that a good goal?
That is not from a Republican source. If I Recall that's CBO's response
Correct.
to our question and concern about trapping people in dependence on government and outside of the marketplace where they can get on the payroll and have a better standard of living and quality of life for their families.
So to be clear, it was the Congressional Budget Office that noted that the expansion, the unilateral executive branch Biden expansion of the SNAP program lowered, without congressional approval, lowered labor force participation among working age SNAP recipients.
Making it lower post-Biden administration than it was prior to COVID. It never came back.
Am I correct that SNAP spending has nearly doubled in the last 6 years as a result of the Biden expansion?
And the improper payment rate or the amount has tripled over roughly that same period of time.
Is there also significant concerns with SNAP in terms of its value with respect to nutrients and nutrition, and concerns about some of the things that it's actually subsidizing in terms of what might one call junk food colloquially?
I don't think you can say in good faith that we are providing supplemental, quote, nutrition with the latitude to purchase some of the products that in fact probably make it more expensive to provide Medicaid for the various disease states.
And it's true
it causes.
that SNAP as well as Medicaid are going to a significant number of people who are able-bodied and people that could otherwise work, and therefore the reforms that we could put in place would actually preserve the ability to ensure that people who are the most vulnerable and the people who are disabled and the people for whom these programs were originally designed and developed, that we could make reforms that would do that and save significant federal money.
And as I did with the ranking member.
I'll wrap up here shortly.
That's correct, and President Biden waived work requirements, rejected states who applied for work requirements as part of their Medicaid waiver, and so there was no commitment to able-bodied adults either looking for a job, having a job, or volunteering at a minimum of 20 hours a week. And so it's no wonder that we have 10 million more people. These were the folks who came onto the Medicaid rolls and SNAP rolls during COVID who persist to this day on those welfare rolls.
In the last 10 years, improper payments for Medicaid have exceeded $500 billion, which equates to $4,300 per household. Would that be a surprising number to the chairman?
No.
So there's significant room for reform in Medicaid.
Significant.
To the extent that we can have those conversations.
Will the gentleman yield on
yeah,
that point?
Sure.
Lest the American people believe the false statements and the scare tactics of my Democrat colleagues, if you simply go back to the pre-Biden era, the Trump administration, and review for eligibility the Medicaid rolls, not once but twice a year, you actually ensure program integrity, that tax dollars are going to the most vulnerable people who it was intended to serve, and you save tax dollars not only today, but those who will bear the deferred tax, which is our debt, about $150 billion. That is one simple program integrity reform that existed under President Trump's administration that was revoked under the Biden administration, that is costing everybody, the vulnerable, the taxpayer, and the entire nation, and especially our children who are paying for that wasteful spending.
I appreciate the chairman. There's a lot we could get into with respect to that issue, but I want to be mindful of my colleagues' time. But it's really important to understand that when you're talking about reforming programs, a lot of my colleagues, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, will say things that, well, we can't, why are you focusing on discretionary spending rather than dealing with mandatory spending? Well, here we are. What's everybody going to do? Are we going to sit down and figure this out together, bipartisan basis, our side of the aisle, whatever, and actually address the issue with respect to mandatory spending? Or are we going to walk away from it and then just shrug our shoulders? And I have friends of mine that say, well, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. Well, now's your time. Now's your time. Let's deal with the spending problem. And to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I would point out that this budget does, in fact, made a significant change under the leadership of the chairman to ensure that we tied together what we can accomplish on the spending side with the tax side. And that was an important part of the debate and the discussion with what we did in the committee by ensuring that we must have spending restraint along with what we're trying to do on tax policy. With that, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Ms. Scanlon for her questions.
I'll yield to the ranking member for a minute.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I'm so sick and tired of this being a fact-free zone. I mean, it just, I get it. The guy who's in the White House, you know, likes to not tell the truth, and people let him get away with it. But we ought to be telling the truth in this committee. First of all, the increase in the SNAP benefit was not unilateral. Maybe the gentleman didn't realize this, but the 2018 bipartisan farm bill, written by Republicans, told USDA to do the update. That's just a fact. You can go look at the 2018 farm bill if you don't believe me. Most recipients on SNAP are kids, seniors, and people with disabilities. I'm sorry that you don't feel we have an obligation to make sure they get enough to eat. SNAP is linked with improved health outcomes and lower health care costs, so we actually save money. When people don't have access to food and nutrition, they don't learn in school. When seniors go without meals on a regular basis and take their prescriptions on an empty stomach, they're in an emergency room. Workers are less productive when they're hungry. And I want to correct the record because what the gentleman just said is not true. Most recipients of SNAP, again, are kids, seniors, and people with disabilities. Of the rest, the majority work. The majority work. 2/3 of SNAP participants are in families with children, and over a third are in a household with older adults or people with disabilities, oftentimes people taking care of their parents. Maybe if we had a more fair tax code and a more fair economy, working families would not have to be on SNAP. This tax bill ensures that that won't happen. And again, I mean, the idea that $230 billion is going to be cut from this program is shameful. And people who support this bill should be ashamed that they're going to make hunger worse in this country. I thank the gentlelady. I yield back.
Yields back to the gentlelady.
Thank you. Look, I spent all last week at home talking to